He came from the heartland, where hands are calloused and strength is built in the dirt. A farm boy turned wrestler, a wrestler turned king. In the cage, Matt Hughes was relentless, dominant, a champion who crushed men and made them feel it. To some, he was a hero, to others, a bully wrapped in gold. But no man is invincible. One day, the world struck back. A train, a truck, a moment frozen in time. He survived, but survival changes a man. The body heals, but what of the mind? What of the soul? This is Matt Hughes. Welcome to Deeper Into the Cage. Hello, my friends. Welcome to my home studio. My name is Robin Black. I'm a martial artist, and I was the creative consultant on season 1 of Dark Side of the Cage. I also was the fight coordinator for the reenactments. Episode 9 of Dark Side of the Cage is on Matt Hughes. In this podcast, we're going to look a little bit deeper. I'm going to have a guest today, Dr. Faisal Rahman. Dr. Faisal is a cage-side physician, a martial artist in his own right, and a brilliant, brilliant man. He joined us for the Ronda Rousey episode to talk about concussions and things like that. And today he's going to talk about Matt Hughes' injuries that he sustained in his car accident as he collided with a train. Matt Hughes, of course, a fascinating, fascinating individual, a great champion, and a really wild episode of Dark Side of the Cage. Let's take a look at that trailer right now. Dark Side of the Cage, Matt Hughes.
Matt Hughes, just the greatest fighter in the world at that time.
Good old American farm boy. People would fall in love with him instantaneously. And then he became somebody else. He was in his truck and got hit by a train.
Matt was in serious condition.
He was not the same Matt Hughes that I fought.
Depression hit him pretty quickly.
She allegedly took his cell phone because he was communicating with other women. He goes, "I'm gonna shoot you."
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.
All right, welcome back, my friends. This is the 9th installment of this podcast. We call it Deeper Into the Cage. I look a little bit behind the scenes and chat with some people that were involved with the episodes or with the real lives of the individuals in Dark Side of the Cage. Episode 9 is Matt Hughes. And to be honest, this is a bit of a tough one. You know, the process of making this episode was challenging. I don't think I'm overstepping to say that Matt Hughes was not universally loved when he was fighting and at different times during his career as he's been associated with the UFC. He was a great champion. He was a phenomenal fighter. Somebody who does love him, and he's a very dear friend of mine, Dan Lambert, who is he owns and is the manager, and I don't know what title he gives himself, but he is ATT in Florida, and he's a wonderful guy. Him and Matt are very close, and he tells me some amazing things about Matt Hughes, and he loves him, and I love Dan. So you can find people who will tell you great stories of Matt Hughes. When I went to try to contribute to the episode, I went to George St. Pierre, who is one of the kindest people that you'll find on earth. And I said, "George, would you talk about Matt Hughes?" And he said, "Yes, I would love to." And George doesn't have a bad thing to say about anybody. But I feel like this is going to be the shortest episode of the podcast. For some people, that'll be a great thing. Less time you have to look at my goofy haircut. But we're going to talk again to Dr. Faisal Rahman. Matt Hughes' story is a wild one. It's difficult to tell, certainly difficult to tell in a single episode. A big turning point in his life, and I've got it here, is an injury called a grade 3 diffuse axonal injury. Most of us don't know what that means, including myself, so we're going to bring in Dr. Faisal Rahman to talk about that. I'm going to leave it at that today, and I'm going to encourage you to watch the Matt Hughes episode. It is episode 9, Dark Side of the Cage. You can see it on Vice. In Canada, where I live, you can see it on Crave. Make sure you check that episode out. And let's get right into it. I'm going to get my good friend Dr. Faisal Raymond, and he's going to shed some light on this injury and whatever else we can dig into about Matt Hughes. Are you familiar with Matt Hughes' injury that he sustained when his car collided with a train?
So first of all, Robin, thank you again for having me on. I love speaking to you, and it's a big honor for me. Absolutely. The Matt Hughes injury, horrible. I just don't know what else to say. Being hit by a train while in his car. And although I'm not well versed with the exact mechanism as to how that happened, I know there's actually some lawsuits ongoing right now with respect to that. It's the worst form of head injury, being hit head on by in a motor vehicle accident. And, your head hits the window or hits the side of the car, your brain is shaken, and you get severe brain injuries. And sometimes you're lucky and it's just a mild concussion. Other times you get a big intracranial bleed and you're in the ICU intubated. And other times you're left with diffuse axonal injury and you're no longer the person that you were previously. So devastating. And when that happened to Matt Hughes, I was very saddened. He's an amazing athlete, a pleasure to watch in the UFC and to watch him compete and excel as a welterweight champion, but devastating.
And in situations like that, if that were to happen to you or I or a family member or someone we know, what would the prognosis be for healing and improvement in these areas? And what could you hope for as somebody who has potentially sustained injuries like this?
And this is the thing, it's very variable, Robin, because I would dare say that the improvements you make in the first month or two are going to be the most dramatic.
Wow.
And then if you're left with disability after that, it's going to be a much more slower recovery. And likely in many of those cases, if the injury is severe, you may not return to your baseline level of function. But with physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and medical care, you would develop strategies to be able to deal with the new disability that you have, whether it be verbal speaking. You'll notice that Matt's speech is affected, right? Mm-hmm. The centers in the brain, in the temporal and parietal lobe that may control his ability to both receive information and voice out that information were likely compromised. But you can then train other parts of the brain to try and compensate for that using speech pathologists and others. That's just an example. But if after the first 2 months after an injury, if you're left with significant disability, you're only looking for small improvements after that. Wow. That's the main thing, and you got to look at how severe the disability is up front, and then see what happens 1 to 2 months later, and then you can try to give the patients educated information on what to expect.
And if somebody we knew, if our friend, our coach, if Matt Hughes was our family member or our neighbor, if they'd broken their leg, or if they had a severe injury of some obvious kind that we could see, we process that as people different than the brain, which is unseen to us. It must be difficult to in your experience with unseen injuries, for families to be able to process that.
Absolutely. I mean, I know an amateur boxer right now who's going through that, and has had a severe concussion. It was actually a workplace injury. They had done boxing earlier, then had a workplace injury where they injured in the workplace in an unsafe work environment, and had severe post-concussion syndrome. And the school and the board of where they worked is saying, you just had a concussion, you should be back to work in 2 days. And then putting up challenges and roadblocks to them being able to get care. And then mentioning that they're exaggerating their symptoms. The workplace saying you are exaggerating your symptoms, which is just the most horrible thing because it's an unseen injury. You can't see it, you can't appreciate it, and then on top of that, family members and friends will get upset with you because of your personality change, or because you're not doing things you were doing before, or you're not socializing, because they have no clue what the individual is going through. And even I don't really have an appreciation for someone with severe post-concussion syndrome. I can empathize because I know from my patient stories But you can see why family members would start to get frustrated. What do you mean you're not going to come out? What do you mean you're not going to go to a movie? Why do you stay in your room all day in the dark? And even your own close circle will have a hard time understanding that. So it's an issue that's very, very important. The workplace especially needs to be educated on this, because the athletes are suffering because they're not getting the care they need from their workplace. And then there's financial issues they run into and such. So it's a big problem. And the fact that it's an unseen injury is a big issue, Robin. I'm glad you asked that question.
Yeah, it's doing this series, Dark Side of the Cage, we've told some beautiful stories, but we do peer into some of these things, and often you're left with less understanding, or certainly more questions than you started with when it comes to brain injuries and as they relate to fighting. There's a long way to go for us to more deeply understand these things, whether it's an injury like Matt Hughes or a lifetime of combat like Ronda Rousey. There's just a long way for us to go, isn't there?
100%. And we need to do more studies, and we need to provide more support, which is why, I am happy that some promoters like Dana White, I think, are starting to take this more seriously and are providing the athletes with the medical care they need for the most part. I would have to say the vast majority of sanctioning bodies or fight promoters or commissions are not doing that. So, for example, recently, an athlete approached me saying they needed access to neuropsychological testing to measure how much, whether they had any cognitive or executive function deficits from the result of fighting before they could be licensed. Well, who's going to pay for that? That's now between $3,000 and $6,000 for one session, only to get a report saying you may not be able to compete or you may be able to compete. Yeah. And more importantly, that testing is very helpful because it could be done serially, and you could follow how patients do, how athletes perform, and determine what their risk is developing, let's say, long-term problems. But that testing is not covered by anyone, by insurance companies for the most part, or by commissions, or for our athletes who are putting their lives at risk for the entertainment of others. So we need to do a better job providing the medical support. And that's, I think, a commitment that the physicians, the athletes, the commissions need to all get together and try and help provide to our athletes.
All right, short and sweet. Thank you, Dr. Feisal. If you want to see the Dr. Feisal conversation in its entirety, please check out Cage Talk. And Dr. Feisal and I talk about Ronda Rousey, about concussions, about Matt Hughes, about his injury. Thank you, Dr. Feisal. You're a wonderful guy, and we really appreciate you. That's it for this week. I encourage you to go check out the episode on Matt Hughes. It is Vice. It is episode 9, Dark Side of the Cage. We will be back one more time. Episode 10 is on War Machine. Yeah, that's dark. That one is dark. I will bring in a very special guest, Kendra Lust, who is an adult film star, and she knows Christy Mack quite well. And she is a lifelong martial arts fan. I will also bring in a couple of executives from Dark Side of the Cage to talk about, hey, what if there's a season 2? What would we do? Until next time, much love. Appreciate you. Enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
Matt Hughes, just the greatest fighter in the world at that time.
Good old American farm boy. People would fall in love with him instantaneously. And then he became somebody else. He was in his truck and got hit by a train.
Matt was in serious condition.
He was not the same Matt Hughes that I fought.
Depression hit him pretty quickly.
She allegedly took his cell phone because he was communicating with other women. He goes, I'm gonna shoot you.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.